Welcome to everybody. The distinguished Senator Merkley, who's the co-chair of our commission, and I will both give opening comments, and Ms. Salinas might want to give an opening comment as well, or opening remarks. And Jennifer Wexton will do it remotely, I believe, and some of the other members might be coming. So please, thank you for being here. We're a little late starting. We had a vote on the floor, and there were some disturbances outside the building that caused some of us to get here even later than we wanted to be. Today's hearing, the PRC's Universal Periodic Review and the real state of human rights in China, will come to order. Last week at the Universal Periodic Review of the People's Republic of China at the United Nations, the Chinese Communist Party thought that it could drown out the truth of its shameful human rights record, enlisting its allies to offer pampering praise instead of probing questions, while giving a platform to party-controlled civil society groups over independent, non-governmental organizations, something that is covered in a standalone special CECC report that was released just yesterday. And I invite you to take a copy and to read it. It's our staff did a wonderful job in putting this together, and I commend it to you. But even Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, and the PRC's massive 60-person delegation could not make a lie true. And it is indeed a bald-faced lie that the Chinese Communist Party respects, honors, or abides by international human rights norms. The truth is that Xi Jinping intends to rewrite and reshape these norms to manipulate even international bodies dedicated to protecting human rights to serve his agenda. The truth, on stark display at last week's UPR, is that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party constitute a systemic challenge to the international rules-based order and reject the very concept of universal human rights. It's a sham submission. In its sham submission to the Universal Periodic Review, the PRC claimed that it protects freedom of religion and freedom of expression and looks out for workers' rights, women and ethnic minorities, all who are vulnerable, and they assert just the opposite. It's an Orwellian view of the world, and hopefully people will not accept it, even the most gullible. In reality, Xi Jinping poses an existential threat to these and other rights essential for human flourishing. He tells journalists that they must be so loyal to the Chinese Communist Party, that party becomes their last name. He tells leaders of religions whose roots in China date back to the middle of the first millennia that they must sinicize, which means putting allegiance to the party and to Xi himself before their faith and their God. He claims that women's equality is a state policy, while the Chinese Communist Party decides how many children a woman should have. And of course, the infamous one-child per couple policy has led to massive numbers of sex-selected abortions directed at girls, and they're missing tens of millions of girls, particularly because of this policy. And of course, there's still the terrible reality in Uyghur and ethnic minority communities, even as restrictions have been eased on Han women, blatantly eugenic policy. So they're using it as a terrible tool, a repressive tool of genocide. Despite its best efforts, China has not succeeded at silencing those courageous men and women who insist on telling the truth about the real state of human rights in China, often at great cost to themselves, a cost some have paid with their very lives. Today we will hear from a panel of witnesses who will do just that. Rana Inboden has devoted her distinguished academic and professional career to exposing the PRC's insidious attempts to undermine human rights in international organizations. Ben Rogers has been a passionate and effective advocate for religious freedom in China and for democracy and human rights in Hong Kong, for which he has been denied entry to Hong Kong, threatened with prison, and repeatedly harassed. I know that I read his reports all the time, and he is just a truth teller and has made such a difference in making sure everyone who has ears knows the truth of what they're doing in Hong Kong especially. Emile Dirks has conducted groundbreaking research exposing China's totalitarian surveillance and censorship regimes, documented the PRC's use of dystopian technology to target ethnic and religious groups for biometric monitoring and data collection, and scrubbing China's internet to create alternative realities. And we are particularly honored to have with us today two women who have taken extraordinary risks for the cause of human rights, fighting on behalf of their family members who are imprisoned by the CCP. Rushan Abbas, powerful advocate for the Uyghur people, whose sister was abducted by the Chinese government in retaliation for her activism, and Sophie Luo, I hope I got that right, wife of imprisoned rights defender Ding Jiaxi, now herself a dedicated advocate for victims and their families, all while working by day as an accomplished engineer. Ms. Liu, it is my privilege to share with you that the CECC has nominated your husband for the Nobel Prize for his tremendous service to the dream of democratic China. We've also nominated his ally and close collaborator, Xu Yeyong, democracy campaigner and free speech champion, Jimmy Lai. I would remind everyone, his son, Sebastian, we had the privilege and honor of hearing him in this commission give a very, very passionate and strong and principled testimony on behalf of his dad and all the others. So we're very, very thankful for that. Today, I'm keenly aware that those who are not here, whose voices can no longer be heard from, especially the voice of Cao Zhao Shung Li, who died in 2014 at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, precisely because of her work to amplify the voices of independent civil society as part of China's Universal Periodic Review, the very process we're here to talk about. She was taken into custody on her way to Geneva in 2013, where she was to participate in a training on human rights for UPR. The Chinese Communist Party cruelty objected to even a moment of silence for her. At a UN Human Rights Council, in a hearing I held on the commission after her death, I said she is exactly the type of person the Chinese government should embrace, not jail, discredit, and leave to die. She is not here, but her voice is not silent. She speaks along with Liu Xiaobo, who also died in PRC custody, and with who wrote from jail that their hopes for a democratic China. They made enormous sacrifices to tell the truth about the real state of human rights of China because they believed in and fought for a better China. And someday, when China is free and democratic, these will be the heroes that everybody in a free China will honor and revere. And there are many, but it's just amazing how many people have sacrificed so much. I urge my colleagues and those all joining us today to insist that the United Nations and its member states demand the truth about the PRC's human rights violations and hold Xi Jinping, a man who's committing genocide as we meet, and demand the truth about his record and to hold them to account. With that, I'd like to yield to my very good friend and colleague, co-chair of our commission, Senator Munk.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith, for convening this particular hearing. The topic's appropriate for our first hearing in 2024 because it covers a spectrum of human rights challenges in China. Both this commission and the Universal Periodic Review serve as mechanisms to review China's compliance with international human rights standards in their own ways. The review of China, the fourth since the creation of the UPR process, gives us an opportunity to assess its outcomes to help us prioritize our work and inform the recommendations we make to Congress and the administration. Members of the Commission will find the issues raised at the UPR very familiar. We have documented in our annual reports and explored in our hearings genocide against Uyghurs, decimation of freedom in Hong Kong, colonial boarding schools of Tibet, and China's pervasive surveillance state, among other brutal behaviors. These are facts this Commission has reported, facts that member states raised in their UPR questions, facts submitted by the UN and the stakeholder non-governmental groups to the review session. The Chinese government is obligated by international law to address these matters and put itself in compliance with the law. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how these issues were discussed in Geneva and recommendations on next steps in terms of holding the Chinese government accountable for its numerous violations of the law. We also hope to hear about the methods the Chinese government employs to avoid facing these facts. As one NGO put it, the Chinese Communist Party gaslights the world on its record by self-serving, redefining concepts, and recruiting allies to deflect attention away from its actual conduct. And that conduct is, in fact, atrocious. I command the attention of commissioners and the public to our new staff report, which hopefully you all have copies of or will soon get, on the prevalence of PRC sympathetic groups at the UPR and how they distort the process. Appreciation to our staff for working so hard to put this excellent piece together. The UPR remains a valuable platform for the international community to assess the human rights record of China and of every country, including our own. It's far from perfect, and we will hear criticisms of the process and how the PRC manipulates it, but we must also take care not to let such criticism erode support for the UN system. Its treaty bodies and instruments are the places where international human rights law is defined. It's where it's adjudicated. These universal standards are those that this Commission is mandated to assess the PRC's conduct against. Let us not undermine that work. Lastly, let us remember our most essential role, to help give voice to those who cannot freely express themselves, who languish unjustly in jail, who suffer repression. Earlier this month, I joined Senators Rubio, Kaine, and Blackburn on a letter asking the State Department to raise specific names of political prisoners at the UPR of China. Chairman Smith and Commissioner Wexton led a similar letter on the House side, and thank you so much for doing so. I hope our witnesses will update us on cases of concern. I also note that the Chair and I have nominated our witness's husband, Ms. Lu's husband, as well as Jimmy Lai, Shuji Young, and Ilham Tohti for the Nobel Peace Prize. And thank you, Chairman, for mentioning that as well, because it's another way that we seek to shine a light on prisoners of conscience. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today, bringing your expertise to bear, your courageous expertise, and I look forward to your testimony and insight.
Thank you very much, Chairman Merkley. I'd like to now yield to Commissioner Salim.
Excuse me. Thank you to our co-chairs, Representative Smith and Senator Merkley, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for taking the time to be with us today. Recently, this commission has looked at China's human rights violations on the high seas and deep in the cobalt mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo, but this is an opportunity to align our work with that of the United Nations to peek behind the curtain and evaluate China's human rights abuses domestically. With that, I must also thank Ambassador Michelle Taylor, the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations High Human Rights Council, for questioning China on their surveillance and harassment of citizens in the Xinjiang region and Hong Kong, as well as their mistreatment of Tibetans. In her allotted 45 seconds during the UN Universal Periodic Review of China, she also managed to question China on forced assimilation activities, forced labor, family separation, and sterilization in Xinjiang, and their repressive laws against other marginalized groups in China. Fortunately for this commission and our esteemed witnesses who have taken the time to be with us today, we have more than 45 seconds to evaluate China's human rights record, and I look forward to robust discussion from my colleagues and our witnesses today, so thank you.
We're joined by Commissioner Michelle Steele remotely. She'll be getting on right now, I hope.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this important meeting, and I'm so grateful for that. From the mining of critical minerals to manufacturing, the human rights abuses happening at the hands of the CCP should provide every one of us, and we have to let the whole world know. That's what this commission has been doing, and I'm so grateful to the members and all the witnesses coming out with their courage. These abuses are happening all over the world, including Vietnam. I have a big Vietnamese constituents, and I've been hearing from them all the time that what's going on with that country. I'm glad that we are having this meeting to discuss the continuing attempt by the CCP to subvert the UN human rights system, and UN has to work harder than ever for this. In 2021, Congress worked together and passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I'm glad this commission continues to review implementation, and we are working to shine a light on all CCP human rights abuses. Thank you to the witnesses for sharing with us your expertise on further congressional oversight and other charges needed to improve on this key issue. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Steele. One of our commissioners couldn't be here today, but she asked that I actually read her statement. It's the very distinguished member of Congress, Jennifer Wexton, who is one of our commissioners. And this is her words. The latest UPR review marked the fourth time that China's human rights record has been examined at the UN. Since the first review in 2009, the deterioration of human rights for Chinese citizens and its autonomous regions has been deeply concerning to the world. After Chinese President Xi Jinping came to power in November of 2012, all aspects of human rights from Tibet to Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region, Hong Kong, to Chinese civil society have been in a downward spiral, causing more than 160 countries to address the 2024 hearings in Geneva. Among them, more than 50 states made targeted and detailed recommendations to Beijing on urgent issues. On January 18th, along with Chair Smith and 12 others, we sent a bipartisan letter to the State Department, which the distinguished co-chair mentioned a moment ago that they did the same on the Senate side, calling on Secretary of State Antony Blinken to raise the ongoing atrocities and human rights violations committed by the People's Republic of China during the UPR. We highlighted specific cases of imprisoned Uyghurs, persecuted Hong Kongers and Tibetans, and silenced human rights defenders, and condemned the Chinese government's transnational repression of outspoken critics of the regime residing in the United States and in other countries. I'm glad to see that in the advanced questions submitted by the U.S. government, several individuals mentioned in our letter were highlighted, including Uyghur scholars Ilhan Tohti, Rahil Dawood, and retired Uyghur medical doctor Gulshan Abbas, whose sister, Rushan Abbas, is in attendance today. Hong Kong activists Chow Tang Tung and Jimmy Lai, as well as prominent Chinese lawyer Gao Zhejiang, were mentioned as well. Although they represent only a small fraction of all the arbitrarily detained in China, the list will help ensure Beijing faces scrutiny at the largest international organization. During the review, dozens of member states zeroed in on issues related to atrocity crimes in the Xinjiang area, including mass arbitrary detention, forced labor, and destruction and marginalization of cultural heritage, religious persecution, coerced family planning policies, and reprisals against human rights defenders and civil society. 18 countries made recommendations related to human rights violations in Hong Kong, while 6 calling for the repeal of Hong Kong's draconian national security law. At the last China UPR in 2018, only 6 countries mentioned Hong Kong in their statements. It goes without saying that Hong Kong's worsening human rights after 2019 pushed more member states to take action. The same can be said for Tibet, as China faced unprecedented challenge to its human rights violations in Tibet, with a total of 20 member states making 24 recommendations and 3 mentions at the UPR. Yet the Chinese government continues to deny the scope and scale of violations of human rights documented in UN reports, while offering up its anti-human rights approach as a model for other countries. On the same day as the UPR, the Chinese government released a white paper entitled China's Legal Framework and Measures for Counterterrorism, justifying its policies in Xinjiang as anti-terrorism responses. Beijing argues that, quote, as a victim of terrorism, counterterrorism efforts have brought security and stability to the region. In all future engagement, I urge, this is again our Commissioner Jennifer Wexton, I urge the U.S. government to hold the Chinese government accountable and ask it to end its ongoing gross human rights violations towards its own people and respect its human rights obligations through a meaningful cooperation with the UN system. China has yet to implement key recommendations from UN bodies, including the OHCHR's Xinjiang report and findings by committees on racial discrimination, women's rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. China has not accepted the numerous pending requests for visits by UN special procedures experts. We need to be firm and consistent in our response as we work in tandem with civil society and many courageous activists presented today to ensure China acts responsibly to its citizens and to the world. Thank you. And I want to thank Commissioner Wexton for an excellent statement that just summarized it also very, very well, and for her leadership on this commission. I'd like to now to recognize our first witness, please.
Distinguished commissioners, it is an honor to be part of today's hearing. My remarks will focus on the Chinese government's actions to manipulate the Universal Periodic Review. My written statement expands on other ways the PRC is undermining the UN human rights system. I commend it to you. China's manipulation of the UPR is occurring in tandem with repression that includes persecution of Uyghurs, a crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong, suppression in Tibet, and an onslaught on human rights defenders. The PRC's efforts to undermine scrutiny is intended to conceal its violations, including the politically motivated detention of individuals such as Chinese pastor Wang Yi, Uyghurs Ilham Tohti and Rahil Dawit, Tibetan Yoshi children, human rights defenders Xu Zhiyong, Ding Jiaxi, and Gao Zhisheng, and the trial of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. The UPR was intended to ensure that every nation underwent routine scrutiny. It includes a dialogue where government representatives make a presentation and where other nations put forward questions and recommendations. It also relies on written documentation submitted by the government, the UN, and civil society. The procedure was developed with a vision of vigorous scrutiny, yet the PRC has tried to render it a meaningless exercise and whitewash its violations. One of China's strategies is soliciting soft comments from other nations in order to flood the proceedings with weak recommendations and perfunctory remarks. In the lead up to China's UPR last week, the PRC mission circulated a letter to other nations encouraging them to make supportive comments. As a result, during China's UPR, 163 nations had signed up to speak, which meant that each country only had 45 seconds to deliver their remarks. Thus, many of the statements merely congratulated the PRC, including mentioning its ability to lift 100 million people out of poverty, reach UN Sustainable Development Goals ahead of schedule without mentioning the use of torture, arbitrary detention, and forced disappearances. In exchange, Beijing makes similar statements for other governments, such as stating for Belarus that it supported the achievements of Belarus in protecting human rights and its efforts to maintain its independence and sovereignty. China also appeals to Global South solidarity to protect itself, framing scrutiny of its record as unfair treatment of developing countries. As part of this effort, China is fueling a grievance culture in the Council and sowing North-South divisions that is harmful to U.S. interests. The PRC government claims to meet the guideline of involving civil society in developing its report, but it only consults with government-affiliated organizations. Consequently, China's report was full of propaganda, including claiming that it was one of the safest countries in the world. The PRC also stated that the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong meant that the days of, quote, social disturbance and fear are over, and that stability and order are restored. These claims about safety and stability are inexcusable given the persecution of Uyghurs and the bounties that is placed on individuals who seek exile abroad. It is actively sowing fear. China's machinations have also resulted in the UN's compilation to the UPR failing to omit the claim or the accusation that the crimes in Xinjiang may constitute crimes against humanity. China has also used gongos to intimidate and harass human rights defenders at the UN. As a result, I recommend the following. Commit to continued participation in the UN. American diplomats did a laudable job by putting forward 15 very well-stated questions in advance of China's UPR. Support human rights defenders as much as we can, both inside and outside the country, including those who have fled here to the United States in exile. Counter the PRC's efforts to sow North-South divisions in the Council. Expand cooperation with non-Western nations. Brazil, Chile, and the Marshall Islands actually delivered relatively good remarks during China's UPR, and Somalia voted for the Xinjiang resolution. So there are opportunities outside of Western Europe and North America. Support creative advocacy. The U.S. mission in Geneva could host the performance, Everybody is Gone. It is an immersive performance that portrays the detention camps that Uyghurs are sent to. You asked about the case of people in detention. I do pro bono advocacy for Wang Yi. Nobody has been able to verify his health, his mental status in 3 years. His wife has not been allowed to visit him. I encourage the United States to run a thematic resolution at the Human Rights Council on access to prisoners and prisoner rights. This would also help ease some of the repression that Uyghurs are suffering, especially Rahil Dawit and Ilham Tohti. I also would encourage the U.S. to bolster resources for the U.S. mission in Geneva. The PRC mission in Geneva is twice the size of the American mission. This would allow the U.S. to hold more side events. It would be ideal to have a UN side event on China during every single session. Thank you.
Ms. Inboden, thank you very much for your testimony and your recommendations. Really appreciate it. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Rogers.
Chairman Smith, Senator Merkley, distinguished commissioners, it's a great privilege to testify before your commission, and I thank you for the opportunity and for your leadership. I've been asked to focus on the real state of religious freedom in China and also in Hong Kong. I've been involved with human rights in China for over 30 years and have myself experienced, to some degree, transnational repression. I've received, for example, dozens of anonymous threatening letters at my home in a suburb of London, not an address that I make public, and even my mother has received letters telling her to tell her son to stop doing what he's doing. This is detailed further in my written testimony and also in my book, The China Nexus. Religious freedom has always been suppressed by the Chinese Communist Party regime, but under Xi Jinping's rule, it has intensified. Responsibility for religious affairs has been centralized. Xi has introduced a campaign of sinicization of religion aimed at the co-option and control of religion. New regulations strengthen state control over religion. Unregistered house churches have been outlawed and ordered to join the government-controlled church system. Many Christians have been imprisoned, such as Pastor Wang Yi, whose case has already been mentioned, of the Early Rain Church, who was sentenced in 2019 to 9 years. In July last year, leaders of Lin Fen Covenant Church were accused of forming, quote, a criminal clique. On January the 2nd this year, the Catholic Bishop of Wenzhou, Bishop Peter Shao Jumin, was arrested yet again. At least 20 Catholic priests were arrested in China last year alone. Hundreds of churches have been destroyed, crosses dismantled, portraits of Xi displayed in churches, and surveillance cameras installed. The persecution of Falun Gong and forced organ harvesting continues. In 2019, an independent tribunal chaired by the British lawyer Sir Geoffrey Nice, KC, concluded that this is indeed a crime against humanity. In Tibet, atrocities continue, with religious practice restricted, including through colonial boarding schools in which 1 million Tibetan children have been coercively separated from their families and indoctrinated into Chinese language, culture, and CCP ideology, cut off from their Buddhist religion and their Tibetan culture. The predominantly Muslim Uyghurs face a genocide as recognized by both the previous US administration and the current administration, by several parliaments around the world, and by the independent Uyghur Tribunal. Forced abortions, forced sterilization, forced labor, torture, and incarceration have accompanied widespread violations of religious freedom against the Uyghurs. And the crackdown on Muslims now goes further than the Uyghurs. Human Rights Watch has recently reported that in other provinces, quote, Chinese authorities have decommissioned, closed down, and demolished mosques. So whether you are a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Falun Gong practitioner, or you follow another belief, in China today, it is incredibly dangerous to practice your faith. In 2019, the then Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Ambassador Sam Brownback, said in a speech in the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong, at a time when it was possible to make such speeches in Hong Kong, that, and I quote, the Chinese government is at war with faith. In the recent UPR, as has already been mentioned, 18 UN member states raised recommendations on Hong Kong. Over the past decade, and especially since the imposition of the national security law, The Chinese Communist Party has totally dismantled Hong Kong's freedoms, the rule of law, and autonomy in total breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And the announcement this week that the Hong Kong government will bring forth legislation on Article 23, a further security law, will only intensify and worsen the situation further. Freedom of expression, assembly and association and democratic participation have been destroyed. Over 1,000 political prisoners are in jail in Hong Kong today, and over 68 civil society organizations forced to close. In addition, as Hong Kong Watch documents in its new report titled "Sell Out My Soul," the impending threats to freedom of religion or belief in Hong Kong, religious freedom in Hong Kong is being undermined in insidious ways. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, request that this report, "Sell Out My Soul," be entered into the record, I'd be very grateful.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. The international community must monitor the situation of religious freedom in Hong Kong very closely. The new repressive laws under Article 23 and other laws expected should be closely watched and analyzed for their impact on religious freedom. Hong Kong's plight is illustrated most starkly with the current trial of Jimmy Lai, who is the 76-year-old entrepreneur and pro-democracy activist. He's a British citizen, and I'm privileged to call him a friend. He has spent the last 3 years of his life in prison, and he may well remain there until he dies. He's accused of conspiring to collude with foreign forces. But the reality is, as the head of his international legal team, Keelan Gallagher, KC, so aptly puts it, the reality is, the real charge against him is conspiracy to commit journalism, conspiracy to talk about politics with politicians, and conspiracy to raise human rights concerns with human rights organizations. I have been named in his trial. I woke up on January the 2nd this year to find that along with several other foreigners, including some American citizens and British nationals, our headshots were displayed in court as collaborators with Mr. Lai. The outrageous imprisonment of Jimmy Lai is emblematic of the CCP's assault on human rights, including religious freedom, because he is a Catholic motivated by his faith to fight for freedom. We must stand by him, we must call out this gross injustice, and we must demand his immediate and unconditional release. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ben. I'd like to now recognize Sophie Luo.
Mr. Smith, Senator Merkley, and the distinguished member of the Commission. Thank you so much for holding this hearing and for inviting me to testify. Today's hearing is so important to me as the wife of imprisoned Chinese human rights lawyer Ding Jiaxi, and as the director of advocacy of the NGO Humanitarian China. That is an organization pay attention to the political prisoners. We must continue to speak out about the horrific human rights violations committed by the Chinese government. This is all the more important in the wake of the Chinese official delegations' denials about its human rights abuses and the Chinese government's allies' empty praise of poverty alleviation and so-called rights safeguards at China's Universal Periodic Review in Geneva last Tuesday. Firstly, I want to thank the Commission for treating the cases of political prisoners before the UPR. That is so important and highlight the problem. I would also like to thank the US government for the robust statement it made during the UPR and for its advanced questions, including the focus on political prisoners and human rights defenders arbitrarily detained by the Chinese government. Since my testimony at CECC 2 years ago at the time of the Beijing Winter Olympics, I spoke at length about the case of my husband Ding Jiaxi and legal scholar Xu Ziyong. Chinese authorities secretly tried them and sentenced them to 12 and 14 years in prison, respectively. To date, no verdict has been issued to the families. After Shandong High People's Court rejected their appeals, authorities sent Ding Jiaxi to a prison in Hubei province and Xu Ziyong to a prison in Shandong province. Actually, yesterday, Xu Ziyong's sister tried to go to see him, but was threatened not to allow to talk with me and threatened to jail his sister. In April 2023, following the announcement of the verdicts of Ding Jiaxi and Xu Ziyong, I had the honor to testify before Chairman Smith at a hearing of House Foreign Affairs committees. We discussed how Chinese authorities persecute human rights defenders through enforced disappearance, secret detention, torture, coerced confession, fabrication of criminal evidence, closed-door trials, and sentences, highlighting that the Chinese government has absolutely no respect for any law. Today, I'm holding up an image that shows many current political prisoners in China. My heart aches terribly every time I see this picture, but I put it on my desk at home and I looked at it every day because I know I must let the world know about the human rights abuses in China and fight for the rights and call for the release of all the political prisoners. In my written testimony, I highlighted the main unlawful tactics used against human rights defenders by Chinese authorities with specific case examples, which includes enforced disappearance, torture, lengthy pre-trial detention, lack of access to medical treatment, heavy prison sentences, restriction on the rights of defense lawyer or imposing official assigned lawyers. Other human rights abuses inflicted on rights defenders include enforced labor in prison, randomly depriving political prisoners of their rights to be visited by family members. And right now, actually, this morning, my friends keep highlighting me that tortures also starts in the prison, usually during the investigation, but right now some torture in the prison also. Actually, all the not allow family member to visit them is already a mental torture to the prisoners. And also after they released, the government often keep them still under surveillance. That is what we call non-release release, as well as the persecution or harassment of the families of the human rights defenders, which include imprisoning their wives or loved ones, and depriving their children of the rights to attend school, as well as the imposition of travel bans and forced deprivation of their livelihood. I deeply appreciate the countries, in addition to the US, that specifically asked the Chinese government to end arbitrary detention and forced disappearance and its abusive treatment for human rights defenders during the UPR. And I look forward to your continuous support to the family of human rights defenders as we fight for their basic rights and seek the unconditional release of the political prisoners. Thank you very much.
Sophie, thank you so much for your testimony. And I know you, I don't think you would mind me mentioning that you were baptized in December, and that has given you and your faith an enormous amount of strength and encouragement. Thank you for what you are doing in bearing witness to the ugly truths of what the PRC is doing to your family and to everyone else. Thank you. I would like to now recognize Emile Dirks, who's coming to us via, he's in Toronto, so he'll be on the, coming in through Zoom.
Thank you, distinguished members of the Commission, for holding this important hearing on the state of human rights in China, and for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Emile Dirks, and I'm a research associate at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. Today, I will discuss three aspects of Chinese state-backed online censorship. One, online censorship profoundly impacts Chinese citizens' freedom of opinion and expression. Two, both Chinese and US companies contribute to online censorship. And three, censorship is linked to repression in and outside China. I'll conclude with recommendations for how the US government can demand accountability from perpetrators and provide assistance to victims. So first, the Chinese government severely restricts Chinese citizens' freedom of opinion and expression through online censorship. Inside China, authorities block access to thousands of websites, including foreign media, human rights organizations, and the website of this very commission. One of the clearest measurements of state-mandated censorship comes from Great Firewall Watch, a platform created by researchers at Stony Brook, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, UC Berkeley, and the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. Since its inception in March 2020, gfwatch.org has discovered more than 640,000 blocked domains. Now, censorship is pervasive even on platforms accessible in China. Yet while authorities stipulate what content is prohibited, it is tech companies themselves which are responsible for day-to-day censorship. Citizen Lab researchers have discovered over 60,000 censorship rules on 8 China-accessible search platforms, rules which fully or partially censor search results for key terms, including references to human rights abuses and criticisms of the Communist Party. Citizen Lab researchers have also detailed how platforms censor discussion of political events, including activism in Hong Kong, crackdowns on human rights lawyers, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, it is not only Chinese companies which are responsible for censorship. Citizen Lab research shows that the Chinese version of Microsoft's Bing, the only major non-Chinese search engine accessible in China, engages in extensive censorship. In China, Bing only displays censored search results for authorized websites. Bing targets political material related to Xi Jinping and religious material related to banned spiritual movements. Furthermore, Citizen Lab researchers found that Bing's censorship of search suggestions, though not search results, was applied to users in the United States and other countries for at least 8 months from October 2021 to May 2022. Bing's extensive censorship shows that US tech companies cannot introduce services in China without integrating restrictions on expression, and that these restrictions will be applied to users outside of China. Third, online censorship is linked to offline harms. As detailed by Citizen Lab researchers, a 2019 to 2021 harassment campaign used Chinese social media to distribute personal information about Hong Kong activists. Victims are also outside China. This commission has previously discussed the Chinese government's silencing of overseas critics through transnational repression. On Chinese and US social media, state-backed proxies and online nationalists harass Chinese, Hong Kong, Tibetan, Uyghur, and other diaspora members. Since 2009, Citizen Lab researchers have investigated digital attacks and espionage against Tibetan diaspora communities. And some of the most vicious instances of digital transnational repression are directed at women. As Citizen Lab researchers have documented, Chinese and Hong Kong women activists in Canada have suffered online threats of physical and sexual violence. Diaspora women in the United States, Australia, and other liberal democracies have also been attacked online due to their criticisms of the Chinese government. Now, through online censorship, the cooperation of technology companies, and digital transnational repression, the Chinese state severely restricts the freedom of opinion and expression of people in and outside China. Addressing this problem requires holding companies responsible for their role in online censorship and supporting victims of digital harassment and intimidation. Therefore, I recommend that the United States government do 3 things. 1, publicly request that Microsoft and other US companies like Apple explain how they implement political and religious censorship on their platforms in China. 2, publicly request that Microsoft explain how political and religious censorship was applied to the search suggestions of users outside China and what safeguards will ensure that this will not reoccur. And 3, train US government officials, including law enforcement and immigration authorities, to recognize digital transnational repression and properly assist victims and their families. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Mr. Dirks, thank you so much for your testimony and your recommendations, and we will follow up. I'd like to now recognize Rushan Abbas.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Chairman Merkley, members of the Commission and the staff. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. Today, I stand before you to speak about my experience and observations during PRC's Fourth Universal Periodic Review held in Geneva last week. UPRs are intended for a genuine exchange within the UN framework. This one, however, occurred amid an ongoing Uyghur genocide. It underscored the difficulties in holding China accountable for its human rights atrocities against the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Southern Mongolians, and the Chinese dissidents. China's genocidal policies includes forced sterilization, forced abortions, institutionalized mass rape, forced marriages, child abduction, modern-day slavery, organ harvesting, and the crematoria for a culture that doesn't practice cremation. 12 countries and the parliaments, including the United States, recognize these atrocities as genocide. I would like to underline by providing a telling example that the UN system is under immense pressure by the People's Republic of China. The main takeaways of the August 2022 report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was that Beijing's actions in the Uyghur region could constitute crimes against humanity. This is a grave allegation that the UN cannot and did not raise without compelling evidence. However, it was disheartening to see that the UN's official compilation of its own reports as a part of the UPR process conspicuously left this conclusion out. As much as Campaign for Uyghurs was relieved to see that this damning conclusion of the report by the UN itself was at least mentioned through our organization in the summary of the civil society reporting produced by UN, the fact that UN is debilitated to the point of not being able to refer to its own reporting without hiding behind a civil society organization shows the level of China's undue pressure under which the UN system currently operates. In the lead up to the UPR session, Campaign for Uyghurs filed with the UN its stakeholder submission, which was referenced extensively in the UN summary of stakeholder submissions, shedding a light on China's atrocities. We seek your permission, Mr. Chairman, to enter this document into the record as well.
Without objection, sir.
Thank you. In Geneva, I witnessed how a totalitarian state aiming to silence dissent and legitimize its oppression worldwide worked to exploit this UN mechanism to receive an international seal of endorsement. I was there last week with my team and my niece Ziba, who attended UPR. It was heartbreaking to see her sitting in the room with the very people that put her innocent mother in jail, continuously whitewash their crimes against humanity. Before the session began, pro-CCP students and the Chinese government-organized NGOs were sent to overcrowd the venue, restricting access to authentic human rights defenders. They attempted to limit civil society participation, and it took our persistent efforts with the UN Secretariat to secure access to the hall that clearly had more available space. Defining the UN rules, pro-China individuals spent hours in the upstairs of the gallery photographing member state delegates and the activists from Uyghur, Tibetan, and the other Chinese dissident groups, including myself. Another pro-China attendee was taking pictures of Tibetan and the Uyghur rights defenders as we were standing in the line to enter the hall. And unfortunately, it took repeated cries from the activists to get the UN security to stop this individual. I saw a pro-Chinese attendee jotting down notes on his phone while looking over at an Uyghur activist's computer. This deliberate surveillance occurred inside the UN, a space meant for secure and open discussion on human rights. There are common tactics used by the CCP to intimidate and monitor human rights advocates in the international forums, especially those dedicated to unveiling the true state of the human rights in China. 163 countries requested to speak. Each was granted just 45 seconds to provide recommendations. Over 120 countries either ignored China's dark record or commended its so-called progress. This included nations that, by their own account, should stand against the repression and not endorse it. It was jarring how sharply this orchestrated praise contradicted the realities of the PRC rule that put marginalized groups under an indefensible persecution. As Representative Salinas noted in her opening remarks, I also want to applaud U.S. Ambassador Michelle Taylor for her resolute stance among the 28 countries which spoke against the human rights atrocities. In just 45 seconds, Ambassador Taylor delivered 8 recommendations on the ongoing Uyghur genocide, violations in Tibet, Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland China. As Chairman Smith mentioned, while the session was underway, China released a white paper on counterterrorism, timed to distort the facts and spread misinformation about the Uyghurs. This move aimed to divert attention from the ongoing genocide and shape a narrative more favorable to China's interests. Despite conclusive research, survivor testimonies, and witness accounts, as well as several leaked documents from the CCP itself, side events organized by the Chinese government and the government-sponsored NGOs presented propaganda to cast doubt on the established evidence, which I've discussed further in my written testimony. China's manipulation of the UN and the blatant abuse of the international system undermines the principles of justice, human rights, and the fair representation. Their maneuvers compromise the UN's integrity and pose a direct threat to global stability and human dignity. In my opinion, China's calculated attempts were indeed successful in shielding its egregious crimes from scrutiny and eroded the UN's founding principles and its purpose. The international community must unite against such tactics to preserve the UN as a beacon of peace, free from exploitation. Mr. Chairman, what transpired in Geneva last week was not an isolated case, but a symptom of a much larger issue. The PRC's conduct at the UPR and the permissive attitude in that room served as a microscope of China's broader disregard for international norms, human rights, and the dignity of the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and other persecuted communities. I am defending human rights at the cost of my own sister's freedom as a result of China's transnational repression against American citizens living in American soil. Exercising my freedom of speech put her in jail. It's clear that in Geneva, the PRC operates with an audacious sense of impunity, treating the UN as if it were their own playground and getting what they want. The United States must recognize the gravity of this situation and the urgency with which it demands a response. It's high time nations stood firm against such a bold effort, ensuring that UN remains true to the vision of Eleanor Roosevelt rather than becoming a rubber stamp for a global offense on freedom. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. And thank you for your courage and your sister's. She's in our prayers, believe it. And we will continue to raise her case as well. You know, one of the things I learned about political prisoners was learned from dissidents and prisoners themselves. One of them was Wei Jingsheng in 1994. I went to Beijing, really raising the issue that they should not get the Olympics 2000 unless they release political prisoners. And he told me something. He was out of jail. He had been beaten senseless by the Chinese Communist Party. And then when they didn't get the Olympics, they rearrested him and hurt him severely. He is a great human rights activist, as you know, and defender. But he told me something I'll never forget. He goes, you know, you people in the West, he said it very politely, but he said, you in the West don't understand. When you kowtow, when you try to curry favor with the Chinese Communist Party, when you fail to mention the names by name of prisoners, they beat us more in the prison. When you're strong, assertive, and you will not give up, they beat us less. I've heard that from others, but he said it so powerfully. They knew when we were raising issues, because even the warden would be well aware of that. The world is watching. So we need to accelerate that very, very significantly. And to your point, Ms. Inboden, that and others, we just have to continue. I mean, our database, as you know, as a commission, is second to none, and we need to over and over every delegation that goes, or anyone who has interlocutors with Chinese officials on any issue, from environmental to trade, especially trade, list of prisoners, raise them by name. Why is this person being tortured? Manfred Nowak, when he was the special rapporteur for torture for the United Nations, he did a scathing report on China, the pervasive use of torture, and it was all denied. The Chinese Communist Party just said, no, doesn't happen, and then accused us, the United States, of practicing torture. It was just, it's Orwellian, and it's never ending, and 45 seconds to make presentations. I mean, that's absurd, and there should have been an attempt, to turn the clock off, and say you've got as much time, even if it goes for a day or two or more. How dare they, on the worst violator of human rights on the planet, which gets away with a review with good content coming from the United States and others, but it doesn't get the airing that it deserves. So, so the point of prisoners, we all need to double down on that and make sure that every parliamentarian, every government official, when people from the Commerce Department meet, bring it up. I brought it up with John Kerry once, and he goes, well, I want to keep it on the Green New Deal and things like that. I said, please, you know how bad it is. Please raise it even in all of those venues as well, because every time you do, you might be saving the life of one or of many. And someday we will see democracy and freedom there, and it will come out because we have a new bill we're working on right now, the Gao Zhejiang bill. I'm going to introduce it very shortly, and I'm looking for co-sponsors. And I want to thank Bob Fu, who's been, just never-ending. Pastor Fu runs China Aid. He was a Tiananmen Square activist, was in prison, and he has been a light to all of us. And Gao Zhejiang and his wife and his daughter, who are here, both testified in the past, so we need to really elevate his and the others who are political prisoners. So if anyone wants to comment on any of that with the prisoners, please do. Ben Rogers, the national security law is one of the worst laws ever, and Jimmy Lai and so many other great people. The best and the bravest and the brightest of Hong Kong are being prosecuted, and the key thrown away with regards to them as they go to prison. That the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and all other levers we have need to be more robustly applied, both the United States, UK, and everyone else, wherever we have those kind of laws. The Global Magnitsky Act is a great tool as well. So I do hope we will redouble our efforts there, because otherwise, it's just going to, I'm afraid that some of the business community, and we saw it at the APEC Summit, and this commission did a great job, I think, in trying to rally people there as to, we met with a lot of those who are harassed by the Chinese Communist Party apparatchiks, to use an old Soviet expression. And there's our businessmen paying tens of thousands of dollars to sit with Xi Jinping, to curry favor with him, while he should be at The Hague for crimes against humanity and for genocide, being prosecuted. And, you mentioned, and maybe you might want to speak further on this, on the issue of yesterday, our great speaker strongly raised at the Religious Freedom Summit the issue of forced organ harvesting. I've had 2 hearings on it, one here in the commission. We have a great bill. It's bipartisan. It passed the House almost a year ago, with only 2 people voting no. You never get that, right? No, especially in modern day. It was totally bipartisan because everybody realizes when you have tens of thousands of Uyghurs, Falun Gong practitioners, and other people of faith who are targeted, Christians, Tibetan Buddhists, but especially the first 2, Uyghurs and Falun Gong practitioners, tens of thousands a year who are killed, murdered for their organs, 2 to 3 per person. That's something that Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor, would love. And we have a bill that would go after that. It would criminalize those who, with intent and with knowledge, I should say, procure those organs, and to just put it in neon sights. Stop this horrific human rights abuse, and stop it now, or we'll do everything we can legally and criminally to come after you. It's sitting in the Senate with respect. It's H.R. 1154. I asked the Senate again to please mark it up and let's get it down to the president. We worked with the State Department. They had some initial concerns because I've been pushing it for 3 years. We met those concerns, and now we have a bill that I believe, based on their input, it will be signed. So, forced organ harvesting, I can't even think how horrible that is for someone as they are being strapped down and a doctor is coming over. Some don't even get anesthesia. One of our doctors who testified said somebody was in shock. And that person, as he was taking out the organs, started moving around because he was feeling the knife. It's barbaric. So we got to get that bill passed. So if any of you want to comment on any of that, because, again, your testimonies were extraordinary. Yes, Ms.
Thank you. I would like to comment on access to prisoners and prisoner rights. First, I would love to see a CECC bipartisan letter to the executive branch asking specifically for the president, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor and other cabinet-level officials to be mentioning these cases specifically in their in-person meetings. I think that conveys a very strong message, and it is something that our nation has not done consistently. I would also encourage the U.S. to push for the International Committee for the Red Cross, for UN special rapporteurs who have relevant expertise, such as those on arbitrary detention, torture, and forced disappearance, to be allowed access to China, even though China is very manipulative during those visits. As you mentioned, Special Rapporteur Novak had a very powerful report. That report is almost 20 years old. We need access again. And there's another instrument that China has not signed, which is called the Optional Protocol to the Convention Against Torture. It allows for a rotating visiting monitoring process to investigate prisons and other places where people may be detained. I think these are all very concrete steps. I would also encourage the United States to work with Latin American countries. That region's own experience with the dirty wars and forced disappearances may make them very sympathetic allies in this battle.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. Could I, first of all, very enthusiastically and passionately applaud and endorse everything that you said and all the initiatives that you and the Commission are taking. I'd like to comment just briefly on Hong Kong specifically. I think, first of all, I would really welcome scrutiny of the implementation of the Hong Kong Autonomy Act and the various sanctions and measures that are in that. The legislation is there, thanks to your leadership. To what extent is the administration actually implementing it. That would be one point. The existence of the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices, HKETOs, I know there's an initiative on this which we would really welcome, because they are now functioning not as they were originally intended to, as representatives of an autonomous Hong Kong, but rather as a second Chinese Communist Party embassy. And so I welcome efforts to look at that. We are doing everything we can to push the British government to implement sanctions, which it has not yet done. The United States has, the UK has not. Obviously, the UK has a particular responsibility to Hong Kong. So anything that the US can do to encourage my own friends in my own country, in the UK, to move on sanctions would be appreciated. And then lastly, I 100% agree with your point about naming political prisoners. I spoke about Jimmy Lai in my testimony, and it's really important that we keep the spotlight on his case. But naming, for example, Chow Hang Tung, the Hong Kong barrister who spent now several years in prison simply for organizing a commemoration of the Tiananmen Square massacre. She's a brave lawyer in jail in Hong Kong, keeping her profile named. The 47 former legislators and pro-democracy activists who've now spent the last 3 years in prison awaiting trial. They haven't even been sentenced yet. They've been denied bail. They were elected legislators. Their only crime was holding a primary election, something perfectly normal in this country and elsewhere, and they've been imprisoned for that. So highlighting the trial of the 47 and keeping the spotlight on that would be really important.
Let me, I have many questions, but I would like to yield to my distinguished commissioners and then come back for a second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Inboden, I want to thank you so much for your testimony and for providing suggestions for how the United States can continue to engage in meaningful way with the UN Human Rights Council. You listed out several actions that the United States can take with the UN structure. What else can Congress do to bolster this effort?
Well, Congress does control the budget, and so as I mentioned, the U.S. mission needs to have more staffing, better training. I also, having started my career at the State Department, know that your letters are powerful, and so I would also be making several specific asks. Obviously, your letter on naming individuals was
And we will
very
do that. Thank you.
was very important.
We'll do the letter. Thank you.
Thank
Great
you
idea.
for that. But the U.S. needs to be doing more to defend the UN human rights system, not just the UPR, but the appointment of the independent experts who serve in the special procedure system, as well as the experts who help implement the human rights treaty body system, having individuals with the relevant expertise, integrity, and who are proponents of vigorous scrutiny, no matter which country, is very important. So the U.S. State Department should be monitoring all of those vacancies, being ready to support candidates with strong records, even candidates who are not Americans. So those are some very specific things that I would love to see the administration do.
Well, thank you. And following up on that, you also mentioned that China is not only trying to manipulate the periodic review system and deliberately suppress reporting on its human rights records, but it's now challenging the universality of human rights altogether. And as you specifically mentioned, it appears that they're doing this by creating a north-south divide and asserting that human rights are contingent on economic development. In your suggestions, you said the U.S. needs to find creative ways to poke holes in this false narrative and support developing countries. Can you just elaborate on how to best counteract these efforts by China?
The PRC ambassador will make a very big effort to meet with smaller countries in Geneva. The U.S. needs to do the same, needs to lavish diplomatic attention on them, needs to be going on a listening tour, listening to what is important to them, and finding some common areas to push forward. I think also, as I mentioned, some creative diplomacy or advocacy by the U.S. mission could include a film festival featuring films from Uyghur artists, Hong Kongers, and Tibetans, as well as I can't emphasize how powerful this Everybody Is Gone immersive performances. You actually experience what it's like to enter a detention camp. So I think these are all some things that could really raise awareness. And in Geneva, doing those things could make it more difficult for some of those countries who have gone along with China to maybe just don't speak up during China's UPR, don't make the weak recommendations, just abstain, even if China threatens to withdraw your aid.
Thank you. And one more question, if I may. Thank you. Mrs. Luo, thank you so much for being here today and for your sincere and heartfelt story. I want to offer my sympathy for what you are going through and what you've done to endure all of this. And while all your testimony about the treatment of political prisoners is shocking, I was really struck by the lack of communication and access that family members and attorneys have to these individuals. Is this the norm for all court proceedings in China, or do you, and I'm a new commissioner, so forgive me, or do you think this is an additional scare tactic imposed on people like your husband who dare to speak out?
Excuse me, you are asking, is it a norm? What do you mean?
Yes.
You are saying they do not allow the family member to visit the prisoner? Normally, in the law, in the prison law, it is a right protected by the law that people, the family member, is allowed to meet the prisoner, and actually they could, and also at least they can communicate by letters, and also they can call family home, paid by the family. But all these are getting less and less. I see in the past years, just Rana mentioned, Pastor Wang Yi's family had a difficulty to get to meet him. And right now, although they are able to meet him, they are not allowed to speak to anyone. Same as Xu Ziyong's sister I just mentioned. And right now, my husband's family, they dare not to go to see them because the moment they go to see them, the security person start to harass them and threat them. So this became, it's a law, but totally not being respected in China.
Thank you. And truly the reason for my question is just to highlight this duality, right? The out-facing to the rest of the world, but then really how they treat people who speak out against their practices. So thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Zenke.
Thank you for all your testimony. It is important. I guess bring it home to University of Montana, home of the Grizzlies. It's been in the news, at least in Montana recently, that there are being exchanges funded by the Chinese United States Exchange Foundation Program, which is currently connected to the CCP influence entity. And I was noticing that the University of Austin rejected those similar requests and funding overtures. So could you explain to me what the exchanges are, the purpose in your opinion, and why did you reject it?
Sir, that's an excellent question. I think that there are many reasons to be worried about CCP-backed programs like that, the Confucius Institutes and others. The Confucius Institutes are only part of the broader effort that the PRC is making in terms of propaganda in the academies too. In all honesty, it was my husband, Professor William Inboden, who was deeply involved in speaking with university leadership and making them aware of some of those dangers. I'm very proud of his work on that, but I need to give credit that it was that Inboden that took on that battle.
And do you have any advice for the University of Montana, the home of the Grizzlies?
Why don't you have me come and give a talk and talk to them about some of the dangers of CCP propaganda and the CCP's vision for world order?
You know, I'll thank you so much. The president is a personal friend of mine and a special forces individual. I'll reach out, and I'd love to see that. Shifting to TikTok, it seems to me TikTok is an influencer that is emanating from, or at least controlled in the database by China. It seems that influencers and those that participate largely in the platform are young. The demographic would point to X generation and the influencers and that. And we've seen a recent influence on LNG, probably as a trial as we go forward in the election. I would imagine there's going to be others. Either try to manipulate popular opinion, et cetera, targeted on certain objectives. I guess my comment is for those of us that perhaps are a little past the X generation, looking at it. I guess, Dr. Dirks, you seem to be the youngest in the audience, or at least the participation. Is there some advice in what language our generation can use to talk to the younger generation about some of the dangers involved in broad participation and utilizing the TikTok as a platform of preference? Dr.
Well, thank you for your question, and thank you for acknowledging me as maybe the youngest person there. I don't know if that's true. But what I would recommend is that the Citizen Lab has produced a short document which is looking at the comparison of TikTok with its Chinese counterpart, Douyin. I believe that would be the best resource for looking at the particular privacy concerns that surround both platforms. I'll note that in the analysis that Citizen Lab researchers have done on TikTok, they've found that TikTok collects similar kinds of data to other social media platforms, such as Facebook. A lot of this is for the purpose of creating targeted ads towards users. Now, one of the things to be clear about is that our analysis at the lab was very explicit in that we had no visibility into what happened to user data once it was collected and transmitted by TikTok back to its servers. It's possible that the Chinese government may use unconventional ways to obtain user data, for example, through national security law legislation, which it could apply to TikTok's parent company, ByteDance. This is a plausible scenario, but it's also a speculative scenario. However, again, the focus of that research was looking at comparing TikTok and Douyin, and researchers found no particular evidence that the Chinese government was using any measures to pressure ByteDance. What I will say as well is that it also seems perhaps unlikely that TikTok is spreading views which are overly favorable of the Chinese government on its own platform. What's more, I think that if we're looking at kind of general privacy concerns or content concerns on TikTok, I think what this really highlights is the need for a broader discussion about data privacy and content moderation, not just on TikTok, but on a variety of social media platforms, be it Facebook, be it X, Instagram, or anything else.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate what you do. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Zinke. Commissioner Nunn.
First off, well said, Commissioner Zinke. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the bipartisan members of this, and most importantly, thank you to the panel here today. I mean, this is just very powerful testimony that you've shared, not just in this committee room, but the rest of the world is watching. As we look at the lies and deception that are being facilitated by the Chinese Communist Party, this is not new to the realm of China. As a military officer, you know, one of the first things that we read here is unrestricted warfare. The idea here that China is going to use every method to its ends to advance the goals of Beijing, not just on the battlefield, but right in its social media, in how it engineers its economy, and painfully, as you've highlighted, how it exploits its own people to achieve political goals, most notably retaining power within China and expanding that power across the world. Whether it be by most recently falsifying COVID statistics that lets the rest of the world unprepared for a vicious pandemic, telling the world that it's not interested in its territorial expansion while it gobbles up islands, or simply downplaying their military buildup in the Pacific across the area, China has become known as infamous when providing for the West false information. And it's truly broken down a trust that could have been established between Beijing and those of the rest of the world. Now, on the world stage, the United Nations Human Rights Council, China has fudged the numbers once again. However, the falsification here of human rights violation reported by the CCP not only shows they are lying, it indicates that those that are vulnerable populations, that they're not even worth accounting in their statistics internally to China. The Chinese Communist Party continues its efforts to lie about human rights violations that they themselves not only are allowing to have happen, but are actually the director of the infliction of pain that's incurred on it, as we just saw, Ms. Liu, from your testimony. So I want to applaud Chairman Smith, my fellow commissioners, for their continued efforts to hold Beijing's feet to the fire, not just in these committee hearings, but in the important legislation that has been moving forward on this that's now on the President's desk. This truly must be a comprehensive approach, not just from the United States, but that with our allies as well. So the bottom line is that if China wishes to amend its rocky relationship, not just with the West, but with the entire world, it needs to start by telling the truth and being transparent in that truth. So I'd like to get to our witnesses, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Rogers, I'll begin with you. Obviously, we have seen a dramatic transition in all of our lifetimes here in Hong Kong. One of the first things we saw is the extrajudicial procedures that were put in place to pull people out of Hong Kong in violation of the commitment that Beijing made to take them to courts outside. Could you speak to us briefly on how that has had a chilling effect on democracy in Hong Kong?
Thank you. Yes, the most significant development in the last year has been the issuing of arrest warrants and $1 million Hong Kong dollar bounties on the heads of now 13 Hong Kong activists, including those in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Australia. And certainly that has had a chilling effect. Some of those individuals who are courageous, long-standing activists have very understandably rethought how public they should be, not so much for their own safety, but because their family members in Hong Kong, after the issuing of these arrest warrants, were then called in for questioning. So the threat and the use of families of exiled activists in Hong Kong is a really horrific tactic by the CCP.
I want to dig one deeper here. Xi Jinping has identified religious work as being a priority. Can you talk to us what religious work in his mind would mean and what that impact has had on people across China?
Absolutely. This is his campaign of Sinicization of religion. He's now made several unprecedented speeches. His predecessors as leaders of the Chinese Communist Party seldom, if ever, made speeches on religion. He's made now several. But what he means by Sinicization is not enculturation of religion. It's not about adapting religion to Chinese culture. It's about coercing religion to the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, to become a tool of the United Front work department, and to preach not the tenets of any particular religion, but rather the teachings of the Chinese Communist Party.
The religion of Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping alone. Ms. Abbas, you obviously are a religious minority. You represent the voice of so many millions who have been unheard inside China today. Could you talk to us both what the Chinese say publicly, again going back to the lies and misdirection of religious freedom according to the law, and how China has used this according to the law standard to really suppress people using that law?
Thank you so much, Mr. No. You are absolutely right. They define in the books and the Constitution that there are religious beliefs are guaranteed for the citizens. But with this recent campaign of the genocidal policies against the Uyghur ethnic group and the other, the Muslims in East Turkestan, we call Xinjiang province, the Chinese government is criminalizing every single aspect of the religion. just like praying or fasting during Ramadan, or even saying a simple greeting of Salam Alaikum, which means peace be with you. Those are the reasons that Uyghurs can be detained. And they are using the pretext of war on terror and the de-radicalization and putting everyone in jail. We have millions of people disappeared in detention. My husband sitting behind me right now, his entire family went missing since summer of 2017, 24 people. My parents-in-laws, 3 of my sister-in-laws, their husbands, brother-in-law and his wife, 14 of his nieces and nephews. Then when I spoke out about this at the Hudson Institute in September 2018, my own sister, a retired medical doctor, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, she was taken as a retaliation for my freedom of speech, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. So when Chen Chuanguo, Cui Tiankai, one of the former Chinese ambassadors to United States, when he was questioned by one of the CNN reporters, he said it very clearly when he was asked about those detention centers. He said, by holding those Uyghurs in so-called re-education centers, we are trying to make them normal persons. So imagine, because of the language we speak, the religion we believe, and the beautiful culture that we represent, the front of the Chinese government's eyes, we are not even normal commodities. We are not even normal persons.
Yeah. Ms. Abbas, first of all, I think all the commissioners, our empathy to you. As a fellow person of faith, our prayers are with you, your husband's family. We can only pray for the best, but we also have to recognize the systematic elimination by the CCP is something that we equally have responsibility here on Earth to address immediately. Dr. Dirks, I know you're remote with us, but I wanted to see if I could chime in here to speak specifically to how China manipulates this data when it comes to its own domestic surveillance program. And I want to bring in the fact that it's not just the role of the United States. It's the role of the entire world to address internationally China's growing use of digital surveillance. We worked hard on the Huawei prevention bill and the efforts that China is using technology to spy on the West. It is probably even more invasive inside China and really has provided a testing ground for the CCP to hone its ability to surveil, assess, and ultimately detain or destroy its own population, a tactic that could quite easily be used on operatives outside of China. Would you be able to speak to that, Dr. Dirks?
Certainly. So I just want to say thank you to members of the Commission, as well as members of the Tibetan diaspora, specifically Students for Free Tibet, people at Human Rights Watch, and other researchers who focused on the specific issue. We're talking about domestic surveillance in China, the specific issue of mass DNA collection. I wrote a report on this in late September, or in September of 2022, as did Human Rights Watch. And this led to a lot of pressure being placed on a US-based company, Thermo Fisher, which was implicated in the mass DNA collection program in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And it was because of the public efforts, again, of members of this commission, as well as Tibetan diaspora groups, that ultimately led Thermo Fisher to make the decision to cease selling human identification kits within the Tibet Autonomous Region, just as they did in Xinjiang in 2019. So what I think this highlights is that there is a large role, an important role to be played by people in the public sector, in civil society, in the media, researchers, as well as members of legislatures and liberal democracies, to put pressure on both Chinese and non-Chinese companies for their involvement in these kind of programs. Secondly, when we're talking about the expansion of Chinese state surveillance, perhaps outside of its borders, I think where we see the greatest risk is to members of diaspora communities. So these could be Chinese, Hong Kong, Uyghur, Tibetan, or others, individuals who by citizenship are Chinese or because of their family ancestry have links to China. And we've certainly seen under the Xi Jinping administration a real increase in efforts by the Chinese government to harass, intimidate, attack, and even forcibly return members of these communities back to China. So if we're thinking about solutions, if we're thinking about how to address these problems, I think we really need to be thinking about those particular diaspora communities and vulnerable members of those communities. There's a lot of discussion today about political prisoners deserve a discussion. These are people who are under intense surveillance, detention, abuse within China's borders. Many of the diaspora members who are being targeted by the Chinese government outside of China are often quite anonymous. These are not well-known individuals, right? And so I think it requires a great sensitivity, a lot of training on the part of US government officials, again, specifically, as I said in my remarks, law enforcement, immigration, to be able to correctly recognize what transnational repression is, including its digital component, the harassment, intimidation of people online, and how to provide necessary and reasonable support to individuals and their families. And that will also require a lot of trust building between law enforcement agencies, immigration, and those members of those communities and the communities at large.
Thank you, Dr. Dirks. And I think it's worth noting here that the tactics that are being honed, as you highlighted, within China's borders have already spilled over to the diaspora in other countries. In fact, right here in the United States, we were proud to just pass legislation shutting down 40,000 Chinese shell companies that have set up shop. I'm a farm kid from Iowa. It's not just the buying of farmland, it is the whole-scale establishment of a clandestine operation working here in the United States and around the world, buying up so that it can target its own diaspora, but also be a collection agent for U.S. interests on our own soil. This is an immediate national security concern. And while our hearts are absolutely with everyone in this room, we have to recognize the CCP does not intend to operate only on Chinese soil, but to export that directly to be able to influence activities around the globe. Ms. Inboden, you have led some very important recommendations here on what the United States can do. I think that it's important, as we saw with Huawei and other technologies, that in that technology space alone, it cannot be one country trying to turn back this red tide. And I'm not talking about Alabama football. I'm talking about what's coming out of Beijing right now. The reality is, if we're going to move forward on this, how do we get our other international partners to come alongside the good recommendations you've made for what we're trying to do here in the United States?
That's an excellent question. I have said that transnational repression needs a transnational response. I think that there are many countries that are starting to understand the threat that this presents. Australia, for example. I've also noticed a real change within Europe, where China experts themselves have started to face some level of transnational repression. And so I think those governments are starting to understand the risks. So I would encourage the U.S. to pursue within the UN and other bodies joint resolutions, shared initiatives to combat transnational repression, UN Human Rights Council resolution on transnational repression, information sharing between federal agencies, especially law enforcement, on transnational repression. I would also like to see the United States government, I'll say that I think at the federal level, the U.S. has made great strides in recognizing it, but I think that it needs to be much broader and include also state-level officials being aware of transnational repression. I would also like to see, frankly, the UN security understand transnational repression because as my fellow witness indicated, on UN grounds, people feel threatened by Chinese representatives from gongos, and I think that isn't really not excusable. 5 years ago, many of us started making recommendations to the UN on what UN security could do, and I don't think that has been implemented to date.
I want to thank each member of the panel here and highlight specifically, Ms. Inboden, to your point, both what we can do at the international level, but as you highlighted, at the federated state levels here as well to have a unified front. And Mr. Rogers, as you noted earlier, those bilateral relationships with countries that have the capacity to stand up, Australia, the United States, Japan, Korea, Great Britain certainly. These are the countries that have to lead the way. The United States has certainly been on board with this, but we have to stand with our neighbors in communities that don't have the ability to stand on their own. And I look at some of our friends in Southeast Asia, and the island nations, they need the support as well with the largest percentage of, Chinese living in those communities that also face this direct threat, both economically, socially, religiously, but most importantly, politically as well. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Nunn, thank you very much, as always, for your incisive questioning. Let me just ask some additional questions and anything else you would like to say to us, to the Commission today as well. On transnational repression, I've introduced the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Act, which is going after those 3 outposts. It's a natural follow-up to the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and it has passed in committee. It'll be on the floor shortly, and it empowers the White House, the Secretary of State, to end it, to get them out of here. They're a malign influence. We saw it at the APEC summit when they were coordinating the efforts to suppress, especially Uyghurs and others who were all demonstrating. I mean, it was horrible to see how that was their post to launch. I spent a better part of 5-6 hours reading every one of their websites for all 3 of them, and there they are defending aggressively, Ben Rogers, the national security law in Hong Kong. How great it is, and and they're supposed to be the teller of truth for economic transparency for the Chinese Communist Party. It couldn't be further from the truth. So that's one way. Senator Merkley has an excellent bill on the Senate side. We have the companion bill here on the House side on transnational repression. Again, they're both bipartisan. We're hoping to get that legislation passed. His bill number is S-831. Mine is H.R. 3654. And it just protects targeted individuals, trains law enforcement so that they're more equipped and aware of what to look for, because sometimes we've seen this with other human rights abuses like trafficking. It could be standing right in front of you, and you don't really understand, that's not that they don't know. There just needs to be a very significant training capacity and for each of those. So, and there's also other aspects to it, but they're both great bills. They're identical, and we're hoping to get those passed as well. It's got to be done. I've heard from so many in the diaspora on how they're surveilled, worse, they're threatened, and Bob Fu went through with it. He had to move out of his home because of what these fake and communist, Chinese Communist Party apparatchiks again were doing to him, and he got through it. Let me just say too, I am requesting again today, and we're going to do another letter. I've done several. After we got the transplant, the organ transplant, forced organ harvesting bill passed, the Chinese embassy here went into overdrive in saying how all untrue it is, which is par for the course, but they're untrue. They also were making comments about how anybody can go to Xinjiang. They have nothing to hide. So we put together a letter immediately and said, I'd like to lead a congressional delegation to go there, to go to the camps, to really spend a week or 2 there. And we still haven't heard. We've done several follow-ups, and I'm again from this perch here today, from this podium, asking that the Chinese Communist Party allow me and other members to come. You have nothing to hide, we want to come. And, we've done it before. I went, Frank Wolf and I, back in the 80s, went to Perm Camp 35 in the Ural Mountains, where all the political prisoners were and the religious prisoners under the Soviet Union. Not all of them, but some of the best, like Natan Sharansky and others. It took 2 years, but we got there. And we interviewed and talked to every one of those prisoners, and we worked to get them out. But it was such an eye-opener. The warden couldn't believe it when we walked in the doors, even though he knew we were coming. He goes, how did you get here? Well, China has made that bold statement, but we're following it up. We want to go. And the sooner, the better. So I again make that request again. Let me just, Dr. Dirks, thank you for your great testimony and your leadership. Back in 2006, I had a hearing. It was the longest hearing I've ever chaired. It was 8 hours long. We had Microsoft, Google, Cisco, and Yahoo, their top people, all testifying because of their really work to enable the Chinese Communist Party to surveil and to censor all things from the dissident community, the religious community. And one of the most telling things that we got from them, because I asked them all, swore them all in, that asked them, why are you doing it? And they said, well, when a police request is made, they honor it and they give personally identifiable information, and they just fork it all over to people who are going to go now round up, again, human rights activists and put them in prison. And there was one particular one that Yahoo gave all the information on, and they arrested him. It'll come to me. And we had his mother at a hearing, in a subsequent hearing. And here he was, all he told, an NGO in New York City is what they were being told you can't do when the Tiananmen Square time comes around, to remember it and to focus on it. He got 10 years in prison. And Yahoo facilitated the entire thing. They did say they're going to move that kind of information off site, but who knows how well or poorly that has been done. But Google may be one of the worst. And Microsoft, when I just saw the former leader of Microsoft kowtowing to Xi Jinping last June in Beijing, it made my heart sick. Why did he have a prisoner list with him? So not only do we ask every government official, every lawmaker to raise names. And this commission has got the best list imaginable and very accurate. We got to get our people in the private sector, especially big tech, to have prisoner lists and stop looking the other way because they are enabling the cruelty of cruelties, like against your sister, Rushan, when they're silent. Silence means you're okay with it. You got to speak up. So we're going to make that request again of the private sector. As well in the letter like you have asked for, Rana. We will do that immediately. And again, maybe Mr. Dirks, you might want to speak. I think Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, Cisco, and the others, they have to own up to the complicity and the conveyance of high tech that they have now given to the Chinese. Now they take it over. They might even make it more efficient. But it's all used for repression. Why don't they know that? Where's the apology from Google? I was at a internet cafe in Beijing on one of my many trips there. I'm barred now from going. Hopefully I get to go to Xinjiang with a delegation. And I went to an internet cafe, typed in torture, because I was looking for Manfred Noack's his report. And I got Gitmo in Cuba. I got this harsh attack. And everything else I couldn't get, I pushed, the underlink and hyperlink could not get to any of it. I put my name in, that wasn't good. I put in the Dalai Lama, that was even worse, far worse. It just tells you, and and all of that was enabled by high-tech companies in the United States of America, and that is outrageous. At that hearing, I started off, I had just read a book about IBM and the Holocaust. An excellent book, well footnoted, and it talked about how the Gestapo always had these great lists, particularly of Jews, which they hunted down and put into the concentration camps and killed. And it was, how did they always have that? IBM was a major, major, major reason. And I said, past this prologue, they're now enabling the Chinese Communist Party to repress in the cruelest of fashions these wonderful people. So, Mr. Dirks, you want to speak to that. Why don't these companies ever come clean? We had hearings leading up to the last Olympics, and we had some of the companies, Coca-Cola and the others. Now, they're not high-tech, but they're certainly a very, very big company. Just to say, what about the genocide that's going on in Xinjiang? Will you speak out against that? And it was like, one of them did, but all the others would not say a word. So, yeah. But I just, so if any of you want to respond to any of that, I would appreciate it. Mr. Dirks, why don't these companies ever come clean? It's just troubling beyond words. And it also has military implications, as we all know. And that came out in our hearing with Cisco and the others, but especially Cisco. They had a command and control capability they sold called PoliceNet. So that now the Chinese Communist Party police could better track down and share with each other the dissident community and the human rights activists and the religious freedom people. So you might want to speak to that, Dr. Dirks. And let me just say to all of you, maybe you want to respond to this, what happens now? Yes, there will be a response period pursuant to the periodic review, but this should be the beginning of a new focus, a pivot to a new focus, not a one and done. And some report shows up on a bureaucrat's desk, and he goes, "Oh, look at this!" throws it into the shredder. There's got to be real follow up, and And I'm glad that so many did raise, including our government, very, very serious questions. I mean, that is, we got to take this to a new level. That's why we're having this hearing. And so I would ask you as well if you could speak to what's next.
Well, thank you for your question. In terms of tech companies, you mentioned Microsoft, Apple. As I stated in my recommendations at the end of my prepared remarks, I would encourage the U.S. government to publicly request that Microsoft and other U.S. companies which are operating within the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong to publicly explain how they're implementing or why they're implementing political and religious censorship on their platforms in China. Often these companies are not transparent about what particular content moderation or censorship practices they're putting in place. That would be a major step that the U.S. government could take, simply demanding that these companies actually explain how they're implementing content censorship on their Chinese-based platforms. More broadly, I think this raises the question of what are the ethical commitments of any company that is engaging with Chinese state actors, and in particular, the Ministry of Public Security. So this was an issue, again, that was raised in the discussions around mass DNA collection in the Tibet Autonomous Region, and previous to that in Xinjiang, specifically as it related to the involvement of Thermo Fisher in selling human identification kits in those regions. The Ministry of Public Security, China's state security apparatus, there is a long, well-documented history of human rights abuses there, documented by researchers, advocacy organizations, journalists, again, members of this commission. It is not conceivable that corporate entities which are engaging or pursuing a commercial relationship with state actors, specifically the police in China, are unaware of this history of human rights abuses by the Ministry of Public Security, by Chinese state security agencies. So I think it's incumbent on those companies to be able to publicly explain to governments, to the public, to journalists, to shareholders, why they feel comfortable engaging in commercial relationships with a state entity that is known to commit human rights abuses against Chinese citizens within its borders, and potentially implicated in human rights abuses against diaspora members outside of Chinese borders.
Thank you, Dr. Dirks. Rushan.
It's extremely important for our administration to take some necessity tangible steps, especially the U.S. mission in Geneva. They should be provided with enough resources and the capabilities to push back the China's influences in U.S. So whatever we can to provide the resources, the staff, and the funding, they cannot do their job while the Chinese government has 100 times more money and resources. And the U.S. mission in Geneva is at the forefront of this. And our administration really need to take seriously, as you mentioned, Chairman Smith, at the beginning, any kind of kowtowing or leaning into the engaging and the dialogue with the Chinese government, they take it as signs of being weak, and it will embolden them, empower them more. So if we want to hold the Chinese government accountable, we really need to take real tangible steps. Thank you.
Sorry, because of my English is not very good, and also I don't quite understand the rule. When Ms. Salinas asked me the situation, I didn't put forward my recommendation. I am a project manager. Or everything, I think we need a solution, or say suggestion, proposal. Regarding the situation of the prisoners and in China, right now, I have a very simple but maybe difficult recommendation, because I know each of the country have diplomats in China. We have the human rights officer in Beijing, in Shanghai, maybe in the other place. Right now, I understand the difficulty is the human rights officer is not able to do anything publicly. Anytime when they meet with the family got harassed and even imprisoned, like Yu Wensen and Xu Yan. Because the only reason Xu Yan was imprisoned is because she go to meet the EU delegation when they come to China. I mean, this case is a very bad case that Chinese government want to show to the world, even the outside world, pay attention to the political prisoners. They still can detain their family. So what I want to say is, I hope the next more tangible step is the human rights officer in China should directly request to visit the detention center, the prison, ask even, as Rana just said, of course they will cover everything, but even just ask will give them pressure to follow the law they defined by themselves. Because we are not asking you to do anything else. You just do what you write in your law. So this is one recommendation. Another thing I want to highlight in my written statement, I mentioned when both the couple, they're detained or say imprisoned, their children is in real difficulty. The children, no people taking care of them, have big mental problem. And I wish we could have some way to also the human rights officer, just from a humanitarian point of view, they should be reached to be pay attention to. This is the second point. The third point, regarding the lifetime prison, for some of the prisoners, like Wang Bingzhang, he is already 75 years old. He's not going to, I talked with his family, I said, if we ask him to give up what he's doing, of course, 75 years old, he just want to come back home. But he was sentenced to lifelong jail. For these kind of cases, also the human rights officer can reach out to do some negotiation. Because the political prisoners, the cases are too much. We have all kinds of circumstances. But we have a lot can do, case by case. Sorry, I might talk too long, but I have a lot of recommendations I could put forward into my personal written statement. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Ben, yes, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. I'd like to answer your question very briefly, what's next, and doing so in respect to three areas. Firstly, at the UN, secondly, in regard to Hong Kong, and thirdly, more broadly on China itself. At the UN, I very much agree with Rana Inboden that our experience in Hong Kong Watch, when we were advocating for the UPR, we had some very encouraging meetings with non-traditional allies, countries that we hadn't worked with before, that are not totally in China's camp, countries like Peru, Costa Rica, Chile, Mexico. In the end, they didn't come forth with the recommendations we hoped they would on Hong Kong, but they were very receptive to hearing from us, at least their diplomats on the ground in Geneva. So I would encourage greater engagement with non-Western potential allies to try to counter China's influence at the UN. I think we need to really engage the special procedures, the special rapporteurs on all of the issues we talked about. And it's worth putting on the record the fact that just before the UPR, a group of special rapporteurs issued a statement calling for the release of Jimmy Lai. And then just a day or so ago, one particular special rapporteur has come out with a finding that a key witness who is due to appear soon in Jimmy Lai's trial, Andy Lee, who is himself a political prisoner, has been subjected to severe torture, and that he's testifying against Jimmy Lai, but under coercion and pressure and torture, and the special rapporteur has found that and has said, therefore, his testimony will not be valid because it is as a result of torture. Coming on to Hong Kong and Jimmy Lai, I know there is a proposal which I think, Mr. Chairman, you are aware of, from Nina Shea to create a Jimmy Lai Way somewhere close to the Chinese embassy. I think that would be a fabulous step to take, and I will certainly be looking to encourage that in the United Kingdom and elsewhere as well. This week, the Hong Kong government announced a so-called public consultation on the Article 23 security legislation. Well, we know that's not going to be a genuine public consultation, but I wonder whether, in the same way that you have requested to go to Xinjiang, whether the CECC might request the opportunity to contribute to Hong Kong's public consultation on Article 23 and see how far you get with that. And then just more broadly, I'd like to put on the record the issue of pension funds that are invested in companies in China that are complicit with facilitating surveillance, repression, and genocide, but also the issue of the pension fund providers that are withholding Hong Kongers' pensions under the Mandatory Provident Fund, the MPF scheme. I won't go into detail on that, but that is something that I think should be addressed to allow Hong Kongers who are leaving Hong Kong and coming particularly to the UK, but also elsewhere, to withdraw their hard-earned pensions. And finally, if there is an opportunity to do more to highlight Jimmy Lai, perhaps in the form of a resolution, particularly on his case during the course of his trial, to put a spotlight on the trial, that would be very welcome. So thank you.
Great suggestions. On the Jimmy Lai lane, we are working on a piece of legislation. We're more likely to try to do it in front of the Hong Kong economic and trade offices and put it there. Hopefully they won't be there. It won't be there much longer, but that would be one thought. It might be easier than doing it in front of the embassy, because when we do that, it's amazing how much opposition and the ability to spike that, particularly if it passes the House and the Senate. It's happened before. One thing that, did you want to, Rana? Did you want to say something? I wasn't sure.
I'll try to be brief
No.
on your request about next steps.
Yes.
I still believe in American energetic diplomacy. The Xinjiang resolution in the Human Rights Council could have passed if the United States government had advocated for it more vigorously. For China, it was a full court press. For the United States, I honestly think that more calls at higher levels to certain other governments would have secured at least an abstention, if not some votes in favor of it, including, for example, Ukraine. The UN's Commissioner for Human Rights has said that he will follow up on his predecessor's report on Xinjiang. I would like the U.S. to push to be talking to that office, letting them know that mere engagement with the PRC is not enough. It needs to be pressure. It needs to be public. And I would love to see the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights himself mentioning these cases by name. And then finally, I support Sophie Luo's suggestion. I would love to see American diplomats in China asking for access to these prisoners. Finally, in other academic writings, I have written about China's authoritarian collaboration in the UN, including with a group that goes by the moniker Like-Minded Group. They're like-minded about trying to hold back the UN human rights bodies from scrutiny. I would love to see American diplomats try to chip away and weaken that group, making it smaller and less powerful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, let me just ask and follow up. Can that resolution on Xinjiang be reconsidered or reintroduced?
It could be. My understanding is there's a lot of hesitancy about doing that. We can't go back in time, but I think also that the configuration of the Human Rights Council, with China being reelected again, is still not in our favor. I really would have liked to see more vigorous American lobbying for that resolution. It was a travesty that it did not pass because there was the potential for it to pass.
Thank you. Just one issue I'd like to bring up that we've been working on as a commission, our staff and I have been pushing hard on it, and that is the North Koreans who left North Korea, made their way into China, and now in absolute contravention of the Refugee Convention, China is sending them back to North Korea, where there are at least 600 of an estimated 2,000. That was the UNHCR suggestion that about 2,000 are at risk of refoulement, and there's not enough being done to raise it. We've raised it repeatedly here in the Commission, and I have done with so many, but including with UNHCR. But there needs to be a resolution there. Those people go back, and most are women. They go back to a situation where they will be tortured. Many will be executed, and but 600 is the estimation of how many have been sent back against the clear obligations pursuant to the Refugee Convention. There's another rule of law issue where they signed on, they're signatories to the Refugee Convention, they being China, and yet they are just with impunity violating it. And that's a larger question about they sign things and then they, what do they do? I remember for years, year after year, on the one of the major human rights treaties that they would, every time a delegation was coming, they would say, oh, they're reconsidering this, and all the China hands that make money from Beijing would be saying, oh, they're about to sign it, and it went on for like a half a dozen years, and it's useless, and there's no implementation, as for any of this. But if any of you wanted to speak to the Refugee Convention, please do. But I wanted to get that on the record because that is really, really serious. Yes.
May I have permission to speak, Chairman? Of course. In regards to the issue that you mentioned, we have some Uyghur cases around the world. Specifically, we have someone in Morocco, actually, in the last few years, Idris Hassan, in a limbo. And as well as we have some Uyghurs in detention in Thailand. And also recently, there's one more refugee that we spoke to PRO confidentially yesterday. So these are the kind of cases that we need to do something immediately. Our administration, our posts, our embassies should take a step. If previous administration and this administration both declared that what's happening to Uyghurs is genocide, they should not be facing that kind of risk of deporting them back to China. And also on the second related issue, we have a few hundred Uyghurs in the United States. Their political asylum is not even being reviewed, or after the interview, they are not getting the approval. So if we cannot do anything for the millions of Uyghurs back in Uyghur region, at least we should do something for those Uyghurs here and around the world. That's something it's really important and immediate that if we can do something. Thank you.
Let me just, one other thing, I mentioned about Wei Jingsheng earlier, and I'll never forget that. I've heard it several times since from political prisoners, how important it is that their names be visible, and we persistently bring it up, and everyone bring it up. I got another insight. I worked a lot on the Soviet Union during the 1980s. Went to perm camp, like I said before. But I befriended a man named Aaron Kotler, who was a senator in Canada, became the Minister of Justice there, and his daughter, parenthetically, is the head of combating anti-Semitism for the State of Israel. And I met with her recently as well, and she told me a story about Natan Sharansky, who was one of the greatest human rights activists ever, and he was in perm camp, and Aaron Kotler met with Gorbachev, and Aaron Kotler became his lawyer, and it was very visible. And one of the things when Sharansky learned that he had a lawyer, it gave him renewed hope. Here he is languishing, and word got back to him, hey, you got a lawyer. And he's a very prominent Canadian. But he asked, this is Kotler, Senator Kotler, he asked Gorbachev, and Gorbachev wanted to know, why did you let Sharansky out? And he goes, because every time I turned around, somebody was raising the name of Sharansky. So he said, okay, I don't know who this man was. Let him go. Now, that won't always happen, but I think we have to realize Ronald Reagan and Schultz, his Secretary of State, were famous for every time they would meet with the Soviet interlocutor, they'd have a list and they would talk about releasing political prisoners, and many got out. So we need to renew that, with respect, when President Biden talks to Xi Jinping on those phone calls, go through some names. Say, we want, please, let them out. Don't plead, but you can use the word please, I think. And we've got to make that a priority for all of us, not just the China Commission. And so I just heard that story just a couple of months ago, and I was just, Gorbachev was, that's why he let him go. So I want to thank, anything further you would like to add before we conclude? You've been a great panel, so much leadership in this room by you guys, ladies, men and women. And we do have, we have some statements for the record that will be included. The Southern Mongolian Human Rights, I can't read it. Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center, sorry. His writing is. The International Campaign for Tibet, Maju, Hong Kong Watch, Transitional Justice Working Group, Chinese Human Rights Defenders. Without objection, their statements will be made a part of the record. And thank you so much. Your leadership is extraordinary, and you give guidance. And Pastor Patton is here from the Taiwan. Okay, I just want to recognize. I mean, we could almost recognize everybody in this room for your leadership. So thank you. The hearing is adjourned.